Welcome back, everyone. We are live with our 2 p.m. Eastern presentation, Groupies and Stans, examining community sentiment to feminize fan practices in League of Legends esports, presented by Tina Sang and Adeline Piercy. Really looking forward to this one. Feel free to start.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Kojai. Well, hello, everyone. Mostly, I believe it's the afternoon for most people, but good evening as well to our friends in Europe and Asia. As presented, my name is Tina, and this is Adeline, and today we're going to be talking about sort of community sentiment and fandom, specifically in feminized fan practices in the case study of League of Legends esports. So, real quick, again, I'm Tina. I recently graduated, hooray, as a master's in digital humanities from the University of Alberta.
I'm Adeline. I am still a graduate student in digital humanities at the University of Alberta.
So esports itself as an industry is almost entirely predicated on fans and its fandom. Viewership is often its main number or source, especially for revenue, whether it's through broadcasting deals or selling merchandise or sponsorship deals and venture capital. As a result, fandom is perhaps is more important as a source of revenue and as a source of legitimacy compared to other digital industries, though, of course, this is very similar to traditional entertainment industries. A big distinction in esports compared to traditional entertainment industries is the blurring of the lines between fandom, amateur work, or amateur industry members and participants themselves. So unlike in traditional sports, for example, you're not going to find Connor McDavid or Tom Brady, I don't watch the NFL, in your local pickup game or wandering around at your community rink, but you could run into a pro player in a ranked game. This sort of lack of delineation between a real competitor and this access to competition itself, because of a lack of real organized recruitment pipelines, means that fans are both fans and competitors, participants in their own ways, in ways that you often don't see in traditional sport industries. As in this regard, there's also a pretty large distinction as esports has professionalized in trying to make this delineation more strict, as you've seen in an ethnography by Nick Taylor. As esports has attempted to professionalize and go mainstream, there has been a distinct movement towards creating strict professional industry alongside a consumer and economic base of fandom in order to be able to make profit and have some economic sustainability. In this regard, this creation of the audience is not a natural factor of the growth of esports as an entertainment industry, but an active choice both by the industry itself and the community in how it forms itself. In this regard, there is the introduction of fangirls. Obviously, women and other gender minorities have been participating in esports forever, but very recently there has been the growth of fangirls, or those who participate in idol culture similar to K-pop and other organized sort of entertainment groups. In this regard, we're going to define fangirls we're going to use the term fangirls colloquially, but we'll generally define it as anyone who participates in practices of idol culture. In esports specifically, it's been fan sites such as LCS Profiles, which do a lot of the data and recording of personality or history trivia, similar to the way a lot of K-pop profile websites do. There's also a history of fangirls and feminized or female fans in the LCK in South Korea and China, for example, who are well known for art, products, freebies, as well as a lot of very heavy gift and care campaigns, whether that's creating large campaigns to give gifts for players for their birthdays, buying ads on the subway. These things like that are very, very common, at least in Asia. Here as well, there is a lot of work from quote unquote east to west in terms of translations or archival work, especially for Asian American or Asian diaspora fangirls who are often translating or recording work from Weibo or Naver or other Asian social media in these languages, translating them and archiving them for Western-facing audiences, as well as some aspect of activism, as well as reporting on questionable practices, incidents that may have happened on stream, or questionable things that they say. This is different from what's usually formed as the audience for League of Legends or esports in general. Very noticeably, John Needham in 2023 pointed out that 70% of people who are watching League of Legends esports are watching it to improve their own game. This is compared to idol culture or fangirls, which are often framed as being emotionally attached, sometimes even with sexual attraction, to players who are more engaged in players themselves as figures or narrative figures rather than the technical aspects of the game. In this regard, you can see a very strict delineation between fangirls that are often feminized, as we are calling them fangirls after all, and what is considered a real fan. When we look at real fans who are there for technical game knowledge as well as their own understanding of the scene history and its legacies, it is often framed in terms of technical mastery. Whether this is trying to get better at the game itself by studying and analyzing how the pros play, or even their own demonstration of technical mastery of the game and the knowledge of esports itself, whether it's through trying to be profitable through betting, which has gotten very popular over the last few years, as well as the growth of things like co-streaming as alternative forms of analysis to prove that they're perhaps more right than other groups, as well as even the popularity in League of Legends of pick'ems in terms of trying to predict who is going to win worlds or making predictions on the meta for the course of the League of Legends World Championship. These are often framed as ideal fandom. These are the fans that we're looking to have, or at least is the majority of the audience that we have, while fangirls and idol culture are kind of seen as odd, or at least almost an intrusion into the space. These themselves are their own construction, of course. When we look into sort of fangirls and idol culture specifically, it's often in its own way as a new consumer base. This is a new audience that we have to appeal to in vastly different ways than we are appealing to our normal audience, the real fans, who are expected to try to engage in this League of Legends ecosystem more broadly as a transmedia fandom. So often the hope is esport fans are going to engage with the game itself, or they're going to engage with TFT or Riftbound, that new card game, or even Arcane as almost a marketing arm to try to draw people into this Riot Games ecosystem. It also naturalizes the image of the fan as almost always a masculine player who is only truly here for personal participation, a almost temporarily embarrassed pro player. While fangirls and idol culture are often framed as sort of a legitimizing body for geek masculinity, as T.L. Taylor has conceptualized, or this sort of insecurity of esport players is not sexually attractive or appealing, but are real men in their own right because of this audience of fangirls. This is imagining women in a very specific position in how esports are, either very supportive or part of the economic labor. But what's the purpose of these strict boundaries? I think part of it is also that it reflects a lot of the modern cultural image of in gaming communities, especially of between gender and societal roles, which Adeline will get into a little bit more.
So in 2017, Shira Chess coined the term designed identity in reference to video games that were developed specifically for this oversimplified idea of who women gamers were. And as such, games developed for women tended to cater to time spent waiting in lines for things like mobile games such as Candy Crush. Games for women tend to be narratively driven and not based on skill and mechanics based on this designed identity. When women deviate from this designed identity by playing more hardcore games, which I'll discuss momentarily, they can be subject to harassment, judgment, and general pushback from the broader gaming community. Likewise, we are arguing that League fans have a designed identity as well. They're expected to follow traditional fan practices as outlined earlier, and are subject to judgment and harassment if they deviate and form their own style of fandom. Next slide. So Amanda Cote describes hardcore games as skill-based games that prioritize a version of hegemonic masculinity based on an ideal of toughness, aggression, and dominance. Casual games or games designed for women, by this definition, are not included in hardcore games. And we argue that League is a hardcore game by this definition, but so are its fans. Similar to the designed identity of fandom, fans who are not hardcore are often deemed to be not true fans because of this lack of skill on focus and lack of focus on skill and mechanics. Often, fangirls are more focused on narratives of their favorite players and teams rather than making judgments on player skill alone. An example of how this splits the fan base would be in deserving tier lists, who is objectively the best player or the best team, versus wanting a player to win just because you like them. So, as seen in feminist game studies, there seems to be this concept of you can join, but only our way. Um, Fangirls in League are pushing back on this demand by creating their own ways of celebrating the sport through adopting K-pop and idol culture and creating fan bases of their own. And while taking up space as women and deserving to be taken seriously as women are feminist stances, we argue that some of the execution of this fan base is wanting. Fans are trying to legitimize themselves in this space via esports journalism, content creation, co-streaming, and narrative building, but are not equipped to do so with ethical considerations. Likewise, players are not trained like K-pop idols are to deal with this sort of fan practice and may be subject to an undesired level of intimacy between player and fan. So the normalization of harm risk to players is not new, we know that. However, it is paralleled by this demand for normalization of idol K-pop celebrity status of players that they have not signed up for, nor have they been trained to handle. K-pop idols go through extensive media training and fan training before they debut, and there's no such system in place for League players. So while this fan behavior is not inherently bad, bringing idol fan culture into a new context that doesn't have a system to support it will cause conflict and tension. We also know that historically women have been situated as support players to male damage dealers, implying that women's roles in games is to heal and amplify the skills of players and depend on men to carry them through the game. Women feel obligated to fulfill similar feminized roles of caretaking, socializing, and devalued labor in game spaces, as Tina's outlined. And this framing of women bleeds into expectations of fan culture, where fangirls are supporting players by offering them gifts and food and that sort of thing. And in this way, fangirl culture keeps women in this supporting role to men and reinforces an idea of lower gameplay competence. So, by this framing, this sort of fan culture is problematic because of the narrative that it supports and the rhetoric that it normalizes. Hardcore fans often find themselves reminiscing about times when esports was a grassroots community, and this attitude leads to hardcore exclusion of new fan bases that have the potential to help make esports mainstream. It's as though these new groups are intruding on masculine spaces. Thus, we are left with multiple tensions. We want women in esports, but we don't like how they're doing it. Generally, women fans are legitimizing esport player masculinity, but sexual interest can be aggressive or inappropriate towards the players. And traditional fans often have problems with the idea that women are only interested in League or the players because of sexual attraction, which is often expressed in online spaces and real life people fan fictions. We would like to assert that framing these tensions as solely women's problems would be misogynistic. However, something needs to change in order for the League fandom to find harmony within itself and for players to feel safe, respected, and prepared.
Something that also needs to be acknowledged when we're talking about, especially the introduction of women into League fandom or the introduction of women into esports more broadly through discussions of inclusion and diversity, is that women are already in esports and they have been for a long time. While a lot of scholarship around esports and inclusion in esports talks about specifically competitors and leadership, women have been around since the beginning as fans, as participants in their own right. Even in these days, from even collegiate, amateur to professional work, women exist and women are doing labor as found in esports that are necessary for esports to continue to be sustainable, but these are often positioned as supportive roles to main players and competitors. From the top tier levels, not including competitors such as in VCT Game Changers or in ESL Impact, women are often seen in positions of hosts, interviewers, sometimes analysts, but even then very rarely, who are often playing supportive roles to male analysts on the desk or interviewing and translating as supportive roles for the players themselves to a presumably masculine audience. As well, with on the other side of the screen, there are team management and players and women who are often positioned as team parents and team moms rather than women who have their own right. This is especially compared to general managers who are often made men, who are often considered the decision makers in team building and those sorts of conversations, as well as there are a lot of women in content, community management, and social media. And to put it frankly, these are not positions with a lot of upward career mobility. You won't see these positions moving upwards into C-suite or making leadership positions, as we have seen historically with especially male players that have moved into leadership positions as CEOs or founders. Women are often in these positions who are not just having little upward mobility and doing a lot of the labor of narrative and storytelling, which itself is its own stereotype, but also face a large amount of responsibility of emotional labor and having to deal with the narrative with the toxicity and the dealing with community itself. In this regard, women are often placed in these similar positions that we've already discussed in gaming culture. They are doing support, they are doing labor, they are doing emotional care, they are creating social spaces. And this labor itself that already exists, while yes, it is feminized and devalued, is already strictly under-recognized when we're talking about inclusion of labor in esports. The women that already exist here are already being dismissed for their work while we're trying to push women into legitimized roles of competitors and leadership. So this pushback on fangirl culture, this supposed introduction of women, is simply representative and a symptom of a larger dismissal of the feminized labor that does go on in gaming communities, and it reflects a lot of the other sort of systemic tensions and problems that exist in the esports industry itself, whether it's how labor is identified as legitimate or not. We see, for example, the League of Legends World Championship. Who gets a press pass? Is it streamers? Is it fans who are making websites, or is it real journalists? And how does this affect the conversation of labor and what's mainstream in esports? What does it mean for the scope of the industry itself? We've seen a lot of different presentations during this conference that talk about and define esports in vastly different ways. And what does it mean for esports labor and esports work to be legitimized within these frameworks? Along that line, what is the vision for women in esports? Are we considering women labor or women who are laboring in this esports industry as uniquely feminine or doing uniquely feminine labor? Or is there an opportunity to organize and discuss how labor and gender is organized in this space? And as these cultural changes arise, as we've seen with something like fangirls and this change in feminized fan practices, what is the cultural pushback and how do we need to address this moving forward? In that regard, when we're talking about growing interest, when we're talking about growing audiences, what does it mean for esports consumer practices more broadly? Often when women and fangirls have been framed in the past couple of years, it's often been as that image of a new consumer base rather than real equal participants, and how we can appeal to these women rather than the assumption that they're appealed to already by being here. How is inclusion and mainstreaming, especially in regards to DEI and inclusion, framed as both cultural value and something that must be done in the terms of social justice, as well as economic value in hopes of bringing in a wider audience, in hopes of getting more venture capital, in hopes of getting more audience to pay for merchandise? And finally, how do we actually organize this rapid ascent into sort of mainstream practices and growing audience attention to protect players, not just players and sort of media control, especially in these sort of amateurish spaces, but also in terms of players, staff, and marginalized groups? We talk a lot about offering opportunities without a lot of understanding of the consequences that come after. How do we protect people and marginalized groups who are participating in these spaces that already face harassment, who are already facing harassment day to day? And how do we offer these opportunities in ways that are meaningful? So when we talk about sustainability in esports, especially in this sort of guise of like the esports winter and things are falling apart, there's a question of who is sustaining this space. Viewership is so important, but the question of who's actually doing this work is a different question entirely. Thank you.
Excellent. Tina and Adeline are now available to take questions. And I did see some in the chat. Tina, I know you
Sure.
said you had the chat up.
Yep.
If you want to take charge of that one.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to take care of it. So I see from Dr. Scholes that they're asking they're asking about fangirls and seeing the whole thing like a K-pop concert. How do players deal with it? For example, G2 Hansama wearing contacts and then learning how to part his hair. Uh, how is he able to deal with it? I think part of it is also the attention and the conversation about how sexuality is framed in esports. I think there's a lot of fantasy of it would be nice if players were seen as sort of heartthrobs, but also we don't really know how to deal with it. Part of it is also a different conversation of how we're framing players more broadly in general, whether it's sexualization or how we see them as products. If my honest opinion, he can do whatever he wants with his body, and how people responded to it is a different problem and question entirely. I think he looks good. I think he's happier this way, and that's the only thing I can really talk about it. It's both esports and the organization's responsibility to manage what his response to manage what the response is, and it's also in some ways his responsibility to mitigate that for himself. How much of this attention is, especially for being more attractive than he was before, sure, is framed as a problem of women suddenly finding him attractive versus the fact he probably got a lot of death threats for not playing Draven very well over the past couple of years. Why is that more problematic, let's say, than the actual existing problems in terms of toxicity of death threats and this sort of space that is already very critical of these people? Why does this change when it's gendered, right? I see a different question from someone who asks about the lack of barriers between fans and pros, especially for interaction. Is there a conversation about safety for both pros and fangirls? I think a big part in general with esports has been because of its quick ascent into becoming a really large industry, for lack of a better description. Part of the issue has historically been we haven't had a lot of barriers and a lot of argument of more access is more going to be more profitable. There haven't been a lot of conversations of what it means to create public image or media training. I think there's a lot of issues in general with esports where there is a image of a grassroots industry from, let's say, 2014, 2015, where everybody's real and themselves and they're living in team houses and there wasn't team managers and sponsorship obligations or whatever. And a lot of that image of authenticity leads into a lot of this lack of imagination for what needs to exist for player safety. In those days, you could go find a fangirl and then you go to a hotel room. We can't do that anymore because there's a lot of other issues that exist in this sort of broader industry that haven't been acknowledged to be problems. You made me wonder about the divide between consumption-based fandoms versus transformative fandoms, as sometimes discussed in fan studies. I've also seen that this divide is gendered. Yes, so it's something that we've sort of dodged here, but there's also a big conversation about esports are like masculine practices to be much more archival. I love Leaguepedia. It is also a transformative work. River is great. But it's also a lot of the legitimate fan work is framed in these sorts of ways, whether it's VOD review or VOD recovering and these sorts of things. But there's also a conversation about what is transformative in League of Legends itself, or within the fandom itself, that is legitimized because it's mostly predominantly done by men. I would argue co-streaming is pretty transformative. I would argue people making discussions about betting and how to bet and where to bet is transformative on its own because it's certainly not archival work to discuss it. But these are often framed as acceptable masculine ways of pursuit because it's framed in the ways of optimization and gameplay versus, let's say, LCS profiles, which is arguably an archival website because it's recording data, but is seen as a fangirl practice, right? What we consider transformative and what we consider as archival or gendered in that way is more strictly along the lines of more strictly along the lines of technical mastery versus emotional investment. Can you speak a little to how this is part of a larger dismissal of feminized fandom and how they're treated in media and popular communication? Sure. I think a big part of it, again, we talked about this specifically in games, but I think in general there is a broad dismissal of feminized practices in general, whether it's transformative work as well as the importance of feminized labor in fandom and consumer practices. I think a big part of it, again, is capitalism framing everybody as consumers and sort of the growth of a demographic and the growth of an audience in particular, how we're trying to appeal to specific audiences for greater growth rather than a specific group. I think in general there has been a history of dismissal of feminized interests in things, and it definitely leads into this. I think a big part of it, especially for the group of like fangirls that have recently come into League of Legends, is they have been very openly K-pop fans first, which means that there is a mental association for a lot of the newer community of K-pop. Being a K-pop fangirl is a feminized thing, therefore this is weird, compared to the fact that other practices have existed in esports for a long time. An esport content guy is writing a skit, that's fan fiction, baby. I hate to break it to you. It's creative, it's transformative, but it's normalized in a way that something like a K-pop profile website or a fan or like a photo card isn't, right? And how they choose to legitimize these through putting them on stream or using them as opportunities for merchandise is a separate question entirely, I think.
Excellent. And that does get us through all the questions that I'm seeing and brings us pretty much to time. But Tina
Wait.
or Adeline, if you have any final statement you want to make about this before we transition out, that would be great.
I do see one more about the divide in what is real and what isn't in relation to League.
Oh, yes, I see that just
Yes.
popped up.
So I think a big part of Riot is that it wants to be legitimate and mainstream so bad, right? I think Arcane is a big step in this. And for example, I have a lot of friends who watched Arcane and love Arcane and do not want to touch League of Legends at all. And I can't blame them. But a big part of that is also the conversation of what this transmedia sort of like universe, I touch into it, but not really, like really does. Being a fan of Arcane is very different from being a fan of the game, but are they legitimate in terms of being a fan of League, I think is a different question entirely. I think you can see that in terms of Riot moving very specifically Arcane content into League of Legends itself, in which its goal is to try to bring it back to its main product, which is League of Legends. So the question of esports or these other bodies, what they're actually used for, are they simply advertisement or funnels into the game itself, is sort of a different question entirely. I think they're also real in terms of Riot wants to legitimize itself as a media house, which is why it does music, which is why it does Arcane and shows like this. But it's also worth acknowledging that these are specifically trying to bring you back into League of Legends itself, right?
Cool. And on that note, we are going to have to wrap up because we are at time. But if either of you is around and wants to head into the Twitch chat to answer a couple of the other comments that have arisen,
Sure.
that would be great.
Awesome.
And for everyone watching, we're going to take a quick break for about 4 minutes. We'll come back at 2:30 p.m. Eastern for our next presentation. See you then.